And can I say sincerely that I'm thrilled to be here because Gawler has been so special to me. I've got so many fond memories of the town and more particularly in relation to its inhabitants. And that's why, of course, I came back here 4 years ago in my semi-retirement. In fact, just on that note, I just realised tonight that I've been 42 years an admitted practitioner as of today. I was admitted in 1981 on the 6th of April after working around the country, various places, barman, working on oil rigs and so forth. So my topic tonight is heroes and larrikins of this town. However, before I get into that, the three people here I wish to acknowledge who had no idea were going to turn up today. I'm not so sure whether they're heroes, but they certainly were larrikins. Tony Harnett, Johnny Hams and Shane Hennessy. I grew up with those people, have the fondest memories. And in relation to Tony Harnett, he gets a special mention because all through my convent days, whenever I got into trouble, I was told, why can't you be a nice person like Tony Harnett? That was invariably followed by a whack in the backside. And in fact, I remember one day I was playing baseball in the car park of the Kingsford Hotel, and this girl who was in grade 2, I was in grade 1 at the time, this girl who was in grade 2, and had dobbed me into one of the nuns, walked through the car park, so I picked up the baseball bat and chased her, tried to hit her. So the end result of that was that when I went back to school the next day, the old nun gave me a belting on the backside and said, why can't you be a nice boy like Tony Harnett? And then when my mum come to pick me up, the old nun told my mum what I had done, so she gave me a whack on the backside and said, why can't I be a nice boy like Tony Harnett? So this is what I've lived under all my life. So these are three great men who I have fondest memories of. Anyway, let me get back on topic. Heroes and larrikins of this town. Through my experience in life, I've worked out, in particular with Australia, you've got a hero, most times that hero is also going to be a larrikin. And I've met them all. I was raised in a pub. My father was a larrikin. To me, he was also a hero. There were so many of them that walked into that hotel because my father was a returned serviceman from the Second World War. And what a fascinating bunch. It is sad that this was not recorded properly. I was asked whether I could do a sort of a movie show or something like that. I don't have that information. I wish I did. These are people who should not be forgotten. If you think about every major battle through all the wars of the 20th century, there's a Gawler boy involved in practically all of them. In relation to my father, Dad was in the 2nd 3rd Machine Gun Battalion. He fought in Syria, and then on the way back to Australia, his battalion was diverted to Java. At Java, they had to hold back 30,000 Japanese when there was a garrison of 25,000 Dutch and 3,000 Australians. They had no ammunition, they had no weapons. Dad was a machine gunner. All the machine guns were on another boat that went back to Australia. So they deposited on Java and hold back the Japanese. They were eventually pushed right to the end of the island where they had the siege on their backs, and as a consequence, they had to surrender. That started 3.5 years of imprisonment as a Japanese prisoner of war for my father and his mates of the 2nd 3rd Machine Gun Battalion, which battalion was commanded by Blackburn VC. The result was that they spent some time in Java and then transported to Changi, then from Changi to the Burma Railroad, and on that infamous railroad where my father lost many of his mates through the harsh treatment by the Japanese as well as disease and so forth. He was at places such as, famous places such as Hellfire Pass, Clintock. These were places where they had to carve through the mountain a place where the railway could go through rather than go over it. And many Australians died in relation to that terrible task. As a result of that, my father suffered for the rest of his life from illness. In fact, even 20 years later, he was still getting bouts of malaria. And as did all his mates. But what was further interesting was that the Japanese eventually started to transport the Australian prisoners of war back to Japan. The idea was to use them as a buffer zone, as a human shield for the ongoing American advance in relation to the island hopping and eventually in relation to what they perceived to be an eventual attack on the mainland of Japan. So a lot of these Australian prisoners of war were taken back to Japan. Dad, along with his mates from the 2nd and 3rd Machine Gun Battalion, were in a camp, put in a camp where their job, until the invasion came, was to mine underwater, under the sea, coal for the Japanese. Now, this position of this camp was if you went 90 kilometres north, you had Nagasaki. You went 90 kilometres south, you had Hiroshima. So these men were subject to both bombs and whatever radiation fallout resulted from those atomic blasts. Dad only lived to be 59. He died of cancer. So many of his mates also died of cancer. There's a few old rugged ones who managed to live on. There's still one alive now, he's 106, who I see occasionally. But I thought that was quite interesting, that in relation to, this is the type of thing you don't hear about, that these men were smack dab in the middle of the 2 atomic blasts. Anyway, he returned from the war. Because he'd been a prisoner of war for 3.5 years, he had all this back pay coming to him. So he used that to buy the lease of the Kingsford Hotel. He married my mother, and he ran that hotel until he died in 1974. I was 14 years of age, and when I was tall enough to reach the glasses on the top shelf, he had me working behind the bar. That was the greatest experience I've ever had in my life, because all those returned servicemen, all the heroes and the Larrikins that this town produced came to that pub because my father was a returned serviceman. So we had some rippers. We had Slade and Frank Orwood. I don't know if many of you remember the Orwoods. Well-known family. Now, my grandfather came to Gawler in 1919, and he soon developed a friendship with old Teddy Orwood, who was one of Gawler's best drivers, if you remember him. Anyway, they both got on the council of Gawler, and they were great believers in democracy unless you disagreed with them. And apparently some of those council meetings were quite horrific in relation to, skin and hair going everywhere because, they had their way of doing things. So, dear old Joe, my grandfather, was very popular in the town. Dad tried to get on the council at one stage, but I think sensibly no one voted him in because he would have been quite a reprobate on that council. He would have wanted things done his way. But we always remained very good friends, close ties with the Orwood family. Now, Slade and Frank Orwood, and I don't know if you people would know this, some of you may, but at the time of enlistment, when you volunteered, you were given an SX number, and that was countrywide. Frank Orwood was SX number 14, Slade was SX number 15. That meant that when war was declared and Australia got involved in the war, out of the whole country, they were number 14 and number 15 to enlist. They enlisted almost seconds after war was declared. They both ended up being Rats of Tobruk. Quite an incredible incredible story that they had to tell in relation to their fighting in the desert and in relation to defending Tobruk. But they were both Larrikins, in particular Frank. So after Tobruk, they went back to England for a bit of rest and recuperation. Frank had been made a Lance Corporal. The first thing he did after he was made a Lance Corporal was to give his whole platoon leave for the weekend, which he had no authority to do. So off they went for leave. They went to a dance, and a dance hall was full of English sailors. And Frank, who had had a few under the belt, decided that he didn't like the singer at this dance, so he jumped up on stage, grabbed hold of the microphone and started singing. To which this pommy sailor looked at Frank and said something very disparaging, in words I won't use in front of this company, in relation to his singing. To which Frank then jumped off the stage, put his foot through the drum, hit this sailor, and then the rest of the English sailors grabbed hold of him and used him as a football all around the dance hall. Now, when they finally got arrested and taken back to camp, they all were put in the stockade except for Frank. So Frank was waiting for the commanding officer to tell him what was going to happen to him, and all the others went first and got their 7 days in the stockade, and then Frank was called in, and he was called in that Lance Corporal Allwood, come in. So he walked in, stood in front of his commanding officer, to which the commanding officer said, now leave, Private Allwood. So that was the end of his promotion. Anyway, Frank and Lang remained friends for their whole life, and they always used to come to the pub. They'd have the same position at the bar, sitting there, drinking away, and they were an absolute delight. Frank stayed in Australia. Lang went with the 2nd 10th. They were in the 2nd 10th, the Adelaide Rifles. Lang went to New Guinea, where he fought in Milne Bay, which was the first defeat the Japanese suffered during the war. And in that horrific battle, Lang managed to survive, and then eventually he was repatriated back to Australia. So there we have a story of 2 raps of Tobruk coming from this town of Gawler, which is really quite amazing when you think about it. It's such an historical event in Australian history. Now the thing about Tobruk is this, and perhaps it's anecdotal, but I tend to believe it's true. Rommel was ordered back to Germany to explain why he could not take Tobruk from the Australians. And apparently it's recorded that Hitler said to him, this is only a colonial division. It was a nice division defending Tobruk. This was only a colonial division. Why could you not defeat this colonial division? To which Rommel said, Mein Führer, they were not a colonial division, they are an Australian division. You give me 2 Australian divisions and I'll win you the war. And that has actually been recorded, and obviously it was actually said. There was another member of the 2nd 10th from Gawler, Ted Moroney. Now Ted lied about his age. The cut-off point was 39, he was 45. So what he did was to say that he was 39. The recruitment officer let him enlist. He went to Tobruk, he fought the Second World War, came back, and then Korea started. So Ted decides he wants to join up again. So he goes to enlist with the army in Korea, but unfortunately for Ted, he struck the same enlistment officer, who looked at him and said, Jesus, Ted, we only just got you in the last one, we're not going to put you in this one. And his brother Cyril Moroney. Now, Cyril, these were 2 very small men, but their favourite hobby was fighting. They would fight whenever the opportunity was there. They were Irish, they just loved it. And no matter how big the opponent, they were into them. Cyril Moroney, I was working behind the bar with Dad. Cyril Moroney came into the bar and his face looked like a busted watermelon. He was just, covered in grazes and breaks of the skin and so forth. And Dad said, "My God, Cyril, what happened to you?" And he said, "Oh, I got in a brawl with the publican at the South End Hotel." And Dad said, "God, Cyril, you all right?" He said, "I'm fine, Dougie." He said, "It was a good fight and I came a close second." Now, Dad's best mate in Gawler was the bloke who had the Ford dealership, Leaf Peckney. These two together were absolute larrikins. Leaf was in a G for George squadron, bomber pilot, and won the DFC flying over Germany. What he did was to earn the DFC, what he did was to drop his payload, and then he purposely flew to attract the searchlights so that the rest of the squadron could drop their payload without suffering the ACAC. He did that time and time again, and he was awarded a Distinguished Flying Cross for doing so. What is interesting is that in relation to the dam busters, and I imagine some of you might have known of the dam busters when they blew the dams in the Ruhr Valley, Guy Gibson, who was the commander, did exactly the same thing, and he got the Victoria Cross. So one might think that dear old Leaf got shortchanged. Anyway, those two, my father and Leaf, were actually a couple of larrikins. So what they would do occasionally is they'd catch a taxi into town, have a few drinks, and dine out, and they'd take their wives with them, dine out, and go to a show afterwards. Now, I remember after one of these nights, I noticed that there was, something had happened because my mother was very cool towards my father. In fact, she didn't speak to me for 5 weeks. And I'm wondering, well, hang on, what's going on here? It wasn't until years later when I spoke to Robert Packney, who was the son of Leith, and I said, and we just come in a conversation how they used to have these great nights out, they'd catch a taxi in, catch a taxi back, and I said to Robert, yeah, it reminds me of this one night, and my mum wouldn't speak to Dad for 5 weeks later. What happened? Do you know? And he said, oh, I know, all right. He said they went to the Paprika nightclub after they had dinner, and Big Pretzel was on stage dancing with the snake, and your father decided that, well, he could dance with the snake, so he jumped up on stage, grabbed hold of the snake, started dancing with it, and the next thing the bouncers got hold of my father, then Leaf tried to help my father, and then they grabbed hold of Leaf and they both got chucked out. And so, for 5 weeks, my mother never ever forgave me for that, because she was there at the time, along with Betty Petney, Leaf's wife. There are other, heroes and larrikins of this town. There's many of them. There was Phil Allwood. He was a gunner in Bomber Command. He won the DFC for bravery in relation to what he did as a gunner. There was Mad Mac McDougall. Now, Mad Mac had the old Dunlop place, which was now where Steinberg, or Steinberg's is. And that was a tyre place, Dunlop. He won the military cross in New Guinea. And he used to come in the hotel, and he was a very funny man. There was Ray Ronan. Ray Ronan won the military medal in New Guinea. Now, Ray Ronan was the elder brother of a man, Dougie Ronan, who my mother formed a relationship with some years after my father died. And Dougie was actually on the Australia when the Australia suffered the first kamikaze attack of the war. Now, he was only 14 when he joined the Navy. He joined as a cabin boy. And at the age of 16, there he was on the Australia with this kamikaze suicide attack on the ship. Interesting story about Dougie and my mother. They went over to Ireland because Dougie wanted to see his roots, finding his roots. No idea as to where he came from, only that his people came from Ireland. So he went over to Ireland with Mum, both hopeless in directions. They arrived in Dublin, they hired a car, instead of turning left they turned right, and they ended up in Northern Ireland right at the height of all the trouble there. Next thing, they come upon a roadblock with the English soldiers pointing guns at them. They didn't know what the hell was going on. Anyway, the process of finding his heritage, Dougie found in an old cemetery in Southern Ireland, reference to one of his ancestors in the 1600s, and the priest there read it to him. It was a very old church, very old graveyard, and there was a tombstone there in Gaelic, and what did it say? It said, "Hanged for thievery." So that was the end of Dougie's research into his family. Another person that would, a great fellow who used to come to the hotel was Bill Locke. He was on corvettes during the Second World War. Then there was Lou Frick. He was a paratrooper during the war. Now, Lou was under the 30-year rule. No one actually knew what he did during the war, only that he was there and he was a paratrooper and a commando in the Pacific. And indeed, I think it's still very much a secret as to what he and his cohorts got up to in those terrible days. Then we had a number of imports, a number of migrants, and boy, they were characters. We had dear old Don Murray, who used to be the history teacher and English teacher at the Gawler High School. He was a major in the British Army and fought in Africa, and highly decorated. Then there was Jimmy Haddon, a real typical Scot. He was also in one of the Scottish regiments and had been highly decorated. And then there was a favourite of mine, Paddy Sankey. Now some of you would know Paddy Sankey. Paddy was the quintessential Irishman. He was as funny as a fit. And the Sankeys were very good friends with the Lyons family, and indeed, I would have to say that probably my very best mate was Mickey Sankey, one of Paddy's sons. But I used to spend a lot of time with Paddy because he was very, very funny. And he was mentioned in dispatches quite a few times. He was a runner. He had a dispatch rider. And he got himself involved in a lot of trouble. One of the situations was where, because he kept on getting promoted, and then they take his stripes away, then he get promoted, take his stripes away. One of the situations was where he was in a pub in Egypt, in Alexandria, one night. He was a dispatch rider. He'd had a few, and General Templar was the person that he used to have to drive around at times. General Templar was the English general. General Templar had a few and decided to have a snap election. So not snap election, a snap inspection. So they found Paddy. They made Paddy go to where the general was to pick him up. Paddy's 3 sheets in the wind. And then the general was giving Paddy orders as to where they're going. So they're driving through Alexandria, and they come to all these roundabouts. Before they come to the roundabouts, Paddy would say, "Which way, sir?" To which the general said, "Straight on, soldier." "Which way, sir?" "Straight on, soldier." Every intersection they came to. Then they come to a roundabout, and Paddy said, "Which way, sir?" And the general said, "Straight on, soldier." So straight into the roundabout, Paddy drove. Shot the general straight through the roof. And the end result was that Paddy ended up in the stockade. And what was interesting about that is I found out this story when I was sitting with Paddy, watching television with him, and there was a movie on with Sean Connery called The Hill. It was a movie about this stockade and what they put the prisoners through. They had to run up and down the sand hill, up and down it every day. It's a great movie if you ever get the chance to see it. So I was watching it, and Paddy said, He said to me, "Oh, be Jesus. It's just a bastard thing to do that, John." And I said, "What are you talking about, Paddy?" And then I got the full story as to how he ended up having to do it himself because he was put in that very same stockade. He's quite a character. Besides people from the Second World War, what was extremely interesting was some of the real old-timers that came in. One of them was dear old Dave Gleeson. Dave was in the Light Horse during the First World War, and in fact he was one of the first off the boat at Gallipoli on the 25th of April 1915. He was a marvellous man, 6'3", and I kid you not, he was the real quintessential hero. He looked marvellous, even when he was an old man. He was the real epitome of the big, tall, bronze Anzac. Anyway, I saw a photograph of him in his light horse outfit, and you forget about your Errol Flynns and your, whatever action heroes you can think of. This man looked amazing. All 6'3", in probably what I consider to be one of the best military uniforms ever. And that is the Australian Light Horse uniform with their plumes and their hat, their leggings, and and he's standing there in all the regalia. And that's just before he went off to war, before he landed in Gallipoli. Dave had an old Model T Ford. It was the only car he ever had. He bought it in brand new in the 1920s, and he drove it until he died. And I hated going to church. I really always hated going to church. However, dear old Dave and his wife would go to church every morning. So what I would do, along with my elder sister Elizabeth, there used to be a wall on Julian Terrace at the back of the hotel. We used to hide behind the wall because if anybody else saw us, they'd stop and want to take us to church. Every morning I went to church because as soon as I could hear the Model T come rattling along, I'd jump out and dear old Dave would stop and give us a ride to church. This went on for years. And this dear old car, which he kept in pristine condition, served him right up until his death. An amazing man. There was also, and I think Paul mentioned it, a couple of Boer War veterans. Part of my job at 14, when I was working behind the bar, my father would get me to open the front bar at 9 o'clock. Now, in those days, it wasn't just against the law to shut the pub late after closing hours. It was also against the law not to have it open at 9 o'clock. So that hotel, that front bar had to be open at 9 o'clock. So I would open that bar on my school holidays, 9 o'clock religiously every morning, and there were these two old blokes sitting on the windowsill, two very small, weazened old fellows, and they would come in to the front bar, and they'd each have what they used to call in those days a fourpenny dark. I don't know if any of you remember the old pony glass. Years ago, the beer glasses were a pony glass, a butcher, a schooner, and a pony. Well, the pony glass was always called a fourpenny dark if it was filled full of port. So these two old blokes would sit there at 9 o'clock in the morning, and I'd pour them a couple of glasses of port in these pony glasses, fourpenny darks. They did it religiously every morning, and eventually I found out that they'd actually fought together in the Boer War. And I only wished I'd pressed them a little bit more about their experiences in that long ago conflict. We've had, not just, in the Great Wars, the First World War, the Boer War, or the Second World War, we've also had a lot of people who were in Vietnam, Korea and Vietnam. In particular in Vietnam, a special friend of mine, Peter Cleland, we call him Speed Cleland, he fought in Vietnam and he actually trod on a mine and got seriously wounded. Something he doesn't talk much about, but there is another hero. And also a larrikin in his own right. If people know Peter, they know they can be such a cheeky so-and-so and good fun to be with. So, story goes on because it wasn't just returned servicemen from Australia who came to that bar, but also people from the other side. We had a German pilot who came in quite regularly. He was treated with a great deal of respect. We had a couple of ex-German soldiers who came in, and Frank Gawler used to always tease them. And he said, "Oh, we're in the same war, except you're on the other side of the wire to me," you know, things like that. But they always got on so well. It was really an absolute dream as far as history goes. To be there in that environment with these people was incredible. In relation to people who weren't in the army, I've told you about dear old Cyril Moroney. Well, there were a couple of others who I think deserve an honourable mention. There was my great-grandfather. He drove the night cart in Gawler. And what he would do is that he would go up and down, you know, the main street, go through all the lanes, you know, with his night cart, collect all the stuff, but invariably he stopped off at every pub along that strip in the process. Well, the highlight of his career as a driver of the night cart was to upend the bloody thing right in front of what is now Tony Piccolo's office, which is up the upper end of, and this is, you know, this was always talked about, even when I was around, there was always talked about that this night cart was upended up the main street and all flowed down the bloody gutters, down the main street, to which, thankfully, some kind men helped him upright the cart, and there he was, scooping it all up, putting it back in the big drums where it goes to, and there was a dear old lady who came walking along and said, "Young man, what are you doing?" To which he said, "Well, I'm stock taking, lady, and I'm 1/3 short." That's a true story. Now, there was, you know, I spoke about Paddy Sankey, but, you know, there's a few things I need to say about Paddy, because he was really quite a unique human being. I'll tell you how he met his wife. That's quite a story in itself. After the war, Paddy went to Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. He went to it was Rhodesia then. He went there and he worked as a guide for hunters. One night, Paddy got on the booze and someone dared him to ride his motorbike over Cecil Rhodes' grave. And Paddy was always take up a dare, so that's what he did. He got on his motorbike, drove up over Cecil Rhodes' grave, scared all the tourists that were there, because Cecil Rhodes' grave was on top of a hill, almost a mountain. Went right over it, scattered all the tourists. The next thing, the police are after him. And to get away from him, he climbed this jacaranda tree. That didn't stop the police, they cut the tree down. Grabbed hold of Paddy, and he was put in jail, and then his wife, he's about to be wife, Verna, bailed him out. So she got him out on bail. Because I once asked, and the reason why I got the story was I asked Paddy, I said, "How'd you end up marrying Verna? How the hell did Verna ever want to marry you?" And that's when he told me that story, and he said, "Well, after she paid my bail, I thought I'd better marry her, just to say thank you." So really, ladies and gentlemen, that's just a bit of an insight of some of these characters, some of these Larrikins, some of these heroes. It is interesting that in a town like Gawler, if you think of every major historical event that's taken place, in particular in the 20th century, more than likely you're going to find somebody from Gawler involved in that event. So thank you. Yes?
Did your dad get the big pretzel's autograph?
No, I think he might have got a slap in the face, but...
He might Now we have some young people here, and other people who don't know Big Pretzel. Could you just explain who she is?
Big Pretzel, back in those days, was Adelaide's one and only stripper. Burlesque dancer, she called herself. And she was known to dance with a big python. The poor snake was, you know. But the Repeater Club was where she mainly did this, where she was mainly the major attraction. There was a nightclub, and I think it was probably the only nightclub in Adelaide in those days. Yeah. So, yeah, Big Pretzel, my father, and my mother not speaking to him for 5 weeks.
Big Pretzel used to have put tassels on the nipples.
That's right.
One breast go one way, and the other
Yeah. Now, I wasn't going to give so much information in case I offended you.
My husband was in the Bible, so sure I
Oh, it's really...
I actually saw that, and I'm still under therapy at the moment.
Yeah, it's just quite a celebrity. Yeah. Okay.
Any more questions?
Yes.
Who were the two old board gentlemen? Did you find out their names?
I did at the time. I could not remember them. How I came about this talk was that Rotary asked me. I was talking in the. I was having a few drinks in Exchange Hotel one night with a Rotarian, and I was just telling him about the classic people I knew from this town. And he was really quite interested. He said, "Oh, look, I'd like you to give a talk to Rotary about it." And I said, "Yeah, sure, no worries." But then it occurred to me how I wished I had documented all of this. I could have done it, but I was a young man, and was more interested in going out with the boys and hanging around with people like Johnny Hands and Tony Harnett, and getting all sorts of trouble. I wished I had have done it, but I never knew their names. But they were just two dear old blokes who, just stuck together. Obviously, all the way through the Boer War, right up until the 1970s, when they were in their 90s, and they came into that bar to have their fourpenny dark.
They were local, though, John?
They were local.
They were local.
Yeah, or they must have been.
We should get a place with
Yeah,
it.
should be able to find out.
Yeah, because they were too old to drive, and they were always there at 9 o'clock sitting on the windowsill waiting.
They must have walked.
Yeah, they could only walk. Oh, there's another story I could tell you if you've got a moment. There was a real character who lived on Goose Island. His name was George Bentley. George and his wife lived in this little house on Goose Island, and staying with them had a permanent boarder, and I only knew him as Pintley because all he ever drank was pints. Now, back in those days, very few people drank pints. Now everybody drinks pints, but back then it was always schooners. You get into a round, and if you wanted to drink a pint, well, you're seen as if you were taking down everybody else because, the pint costs more. So, Pintsy, George Bentley, and his wife, I can't remember his wife's name now, lived on Goose Island, and it would have been the early 70s. And we had the floods, we had the river flooding. Goose Island was virtually coming underwater. And the fireys who were helping out, the emergency services, they came to the bottle shop to get some soft drink. And I was talking to them, and I asked them how it's going. And they said, "Look," he said, "we can't get George Bentley off the island. He and his wife and Pintsy won't leave, and we don't know what to do about it." So, as I'd worked at the bottle shop quite often, I knew that George loved his port, and always bought it by the flagon every day. So I said, "All right, I'll see what I can do." So I got the flagon of port, and I went over there, went to his house, and I walked in, and there they were. They were sitting down around the table, and I cracked the flagon of port, and I drank with them this port, and they were determined not to leave. No way they'll leave. By this stage, the water was up to my ankles. And the water kept rising and rising, and I finally got them to agree after I'd had a few, and both 3 sheets, all three of them with 3 sheets in the wind. I got them to agree to follow me out, and so we sloshed through the water, and I got them off of Goose Island, back on the main bank, and back into the car park where we looked after them until things subsided. But that was dear old Georgie. And then there's another story about Cyril Mulroney. I don't know why I forgot this one, but it's all about port. Yeah. It's interesting. I think I should start having port for breakfast because I might live for, forever. Because these old blokes, they drink port all through the day. Cyril Mulroney and his cohorts decided that they wanted to get the pigeons off the roof of the Kingsford. So they climbed up there, so Dad said, yeah, that's fine. So I was standing down there watching them. So they climbed up the ladder, got on the roof. Cyril had the bag. They grabbed the pigeons. The only problem was that as Cyril was putting them in the bag, he hadn't realised that the bag was open both ends. So pigeons were going into the bag and out the other end, and finally realised it, tied it up, and started collecting the pigeons. And the next thing, Cyril was sitting up there, he'd sobered up, and he wouldn't come down. So the others came down, and Cyril was still sitting on the roof there, too frightened to come down because he'd sobered up. So Dad sent up a bottle of port, to which Cyril drank the bottle of port and then finally came down the ladder. Believe me, I mean, there's a million other stories in relation to some of the larrikins we have in this town, but
I guess it doesn't matter what brand of port, but any port in the storm.
Any port in the storm, absolutely, yeah. Anyway, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. If there's no other questions. Yes.
Can I just make a remark on your Burma Railway? Because I'm a regular visitor to Thailand and that.
Yes.
And I've actually done Hellfire Pass, River Kwai, Death Railway, and Weary Dunlop's vicinity and that. And people don't really understand what these people went through until you go through the Hellfire Pass. And you can feel the atmosphere, the ghosts of the past and that.
I haven't had the privilege to go there yet. I intend to.
Get yourself over there.
Dad was good friends with Weary Dunlop because he was in the same camp with Weary all through.
The cemeteries over there in that place, I could shock up a lot. It'll take you a week to go through them.
Actually, there's another interesting story about the prisoners of war. My father, I told you my father and the rest of the battalion were sent back were taken to Japan. Now, there was this horrific boat trip where a convoy, a Japanese convoy, heading back to Japan, was torpedoed by a number of American submarines, a wolf pack of American submarines. The situation was that the Japanese would never tell the other side that they had prisoners of war. Under the Geneva Convention, they were supposed to tell their warring party that they had prisoners of war. My father was on the boat trip on this convoy where all the boats holding prisoners were put on the outside of the convoy so that if there were any submarines torpedoing ships, they were the first ones to get hit. So Dad was on one of these ships. It was quite a big convoy. They went through a cyclone. They had a terrible time. Then the American wolf packs came along and sunk most of the ships. There was only 3 ships out of that huge convoy that got through, and Dad was on one of them. If you ever go to San Francisco, there is a historical site which is a submarine called the Pampanito. The Pampanito was one of these submarines that was involved in torpedoing this very convoy. They, of course, did not know that there were Australian prisoners of war on these ships. So then what happened, after they torpedoed a number of these ships, they went back to collect survivors, to get intelligence from what they thought would be Japanese. The men in the water were all covered in oil, so they looked quite dark. So the Pampanito, when you go through the Pampanito, you put on the earphones, they tell you the full story. And this is one of the stories that comes across. So The Americans get in their rafts and their smaller boats to go and pick up these, what they thought to be Japanese prisoners. They've got their Thompsons pointed at them, and then all of a sudden this Australian voice says, "Jesus Christ, first of all you sink us, now you're going to shoot us." They had no idea. So they collected all these Australians, and it's quite a wonderful story, because the Yanks gave the Australians their bedding, their hammocks, everything. They got treated first class, the survivors from the boats that sunk. But Dad was on one that got through. One of the three. Yes?
I met a gentleman that was on that ship, and he ended up in the water for 4 days before he was rescued.
Is that right? Because a number of them were sunk. Most of the convoy was sunk.
Yes.
Not just by the Pampanito. Yeah.
He was on his way to Japan, but he survived.
There's a wonderful book called Return from the River Kwai, and that tells the full story of that terrible convoy and what took place. I don't know if you can still get it, but I read it many years ago. And in fact, one of the people on that convoy, one of the Australians, was a well-known VFL footballer called Blood Bancroft. He was on that very convoy. Yeah.
The gentleman that I met.
Is that who it was? Blood Bancroft. I'll be blowed. Amazing. Yeah. He was on that very convoy.
He was actually a West Australian.
Right, but wasn't he in a VFL?
I'm not sure about that. His name was Bancroft.
Yeah, they called him Blood Bancroft because he was a hell of a footballer and quite a dangerous man to come up against.
His name was Arthur Bancroft.
Yeah.
He was actually the manager of the ANZ Bank here in Gawler for about 6 years.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
Yeah, so he wrote a book on his war experiences, called It Arthur's Story, because he was on the Perth when Perth was sunk.
Ah, right.
So he was taken prisoner by the Japanese on the Boomerang.
And then put on that convoy to go back to Japan.
And then, yes, he was on the railway, and then he was one of the healthier ones, so they put him on.
Yeah, like my man, he was,
It's Richard Fahey.
Well, there you go. No, I've learned something, so thank you very much for that.
I can lend you the book if you like.
I'd love to read it. Very much so. Okay. Thank you.
We've still got Larrikins, haven't we? He's a member of our Rotary Club, by the way, and incoming president, believe it or not, so we're in for an interesting year next year. Anyway, thank you, John. A lot of those names you mentioned I can relate to. I had the privilege of doing years 4 and 5 in the old RSL hall where Coles is now. And Doug Lyons used to come up once a week with the Ford A loaded with booze to stock up the RSL hall, and my teacher was Ken Schofield at the time, and he was also a returned soldier, and Ron McDougall, he was another one that I remember, and they were interesting characters, but what I found was that very few of them would actually speak about their experience in the war. It's sort of, whether they had a mental blockage of it to tell others or not, but it was very hard to get any information out of them. And you've told me more than I've ever believed. But thank you, John. It's been a great night, and I'm sure that we've all appreciated what you've brought to us, and we're looking for version 2, perhaps. Thank you anyway, John. Now, before you go, you don't have to buy fruit and veg this week.
Oh my God. Well, thank you so much.
Great little thank you from everybody.
So thank you from everybody.
Thank you very much.